Capitalism, capitalism, capitalism. Okay, now that half of you are intrigued and the other half are annoyed, let's talk about the C word. Now, we get lots of comments accusing us of talking about capitalism too much, or about how we use it as an easy scapegoat for all the world's problems. And I get it. Most social ills involve the complex interactions of a variety of systems. And depending on your perspective, capitalism has either generated more wealth than any economic system in history, which is good, or it's contributed to rampant inequality, climate degradation, and a host of other problems, which is bad. One defense of capitalism is that it enables some people to make huge amounts of money, which they can then use to make the world a better place without all the hassle of government regulation. Folks like Bill and Melinda Gates and Mackenzie Scott have given away billions of dollars to organizations fighting to make the world more just and equitable. And if you're watching the news recently, you might have seen that Sam Bankman-Fried, who is in hot water for his FTX cryptocurrency trading company, was also motivated by an ethical system that encouraged rich people to make money so they could give it away. Which brings us back to a question that comes up a lot. Can you be ethical and a capitalist? Or put differently, can capitalism be used to make the world a better place? This comes up when talking about everything from work culture to the gig economy to climate change to education to whether or not you can be good and still shop at Amazon. And it touches on a phrase that we've talked about before. There is no ethical consumption under capitalism. It's another version of the type of capitalist realism written about by folks like Mark Fisher, in which there is no outside to capitalism. This is of course also the logic behind the oft-quoted phrase, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. This attitude can lead to a type of ethical defeatism or nihilism, in which we think that because there is nothing we can do to change the world, then what's the point of small-scale ethical action? For example, if a tiny number of companies are devastating the environment, does it even matter if I recycle my cans? It can all feel a bit like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. So let's get into it in this Wisecrack Edition. Can we be ethical under capitalism? And spoilers ahead for the structure of the world economy and its ethical implications in every area of your life. First, let's define capitalism, at least in this context. It's just going to be a small one. It's an economic and political system in which private owners control trade and industry in a free market economy. According to the International Monetary Fund, the essential feature of capitalism is the motive to make a profit. Now, in terms of an ethical orientation, we might say that an ethics of capitalism is slightly oxymoronic, as the ultimate end goal of that system is profit maximization, not human goodness or flourishing. But some philosophers, like Daniel Halliday and John Thrasher, have recently argued there is an ethics of capitalism. If my name was Thrasher, I wouldn't have become a philosopher. I would have become a rebellious hockey player who got kicked out of the league for putting like a razor blade on my stick and like cutting motherfuckers. They think the real problem is that few scholars have noted how often real capitalism has remained absent, or how the current system could be made more ethical without rejecting the economic foundations of capitalism. For them, it's not that capitalism itself is unethical, it's that the real moral spirit of capitalism has receded to the background. Now, a lot more can be said about this, but we need to keep things moving. But hey, if you ever want to see me rant at length about philosophical ideas, join our Patreon, where every month you get a video of me doing that. The link is in the description. Before we can determine capitalism's ethics or lack thereof, we need to ask, what are ethics?
Ethics is a real discussion of competing conceptions of the good.
Why yes, Oscar, that's more or less it. And for most ethical theories, the point is to both be able to deduce what the good is, i.e. how we know what's ethical, and then to figure out how to do it, i.e. how to be ethical. Now we can start with figuring out if one can be ethical under capitalism by judging three primary schools of ethics. First, we have virtue ethics, usually associated with Aristotle. It argues that to be ethical, we first gotta develop virtuous moral character, marked by things like courage, loyalty, and wisdom, and then do moral things which further reinforce moral character. It's sort of like how if you want to start getting up earlier, you force yourself to do it for a few weeks, and it sucks really bad, but eventually you get used to it, and then you pop out of bed, rested, without an alarm, and ready to create surplus capital for your boss. For Aristotle, the virtuous person's actions will always be oriented towards some type of moral good, i.e. you wake up earlier to exercise or meditate or get to work. And importantly, virtuous character is marked by a spirit of moderation, i.e. with money, you shouldn't be too greedy or too frugal. This emphasis makes virtue ethics feel incompatible with capitalism, whose logic necessitates a lack of moderation in service of constant economic growth. After all, Ronald Reagan didn't call for moderate growth, saying instead that there are no such things as limits to growth because there are no limits to the human capacity for intelligence, imagination, and wonder. Next, we have deontology, associated associated with Immanuel Kant. Deontology's clearest articulation is Kant's categorical imperative. Act as if the maxims of your action were to become through your will a universal law of nature. This means that every moral decision should be based on the idea that you would want your action to be a universal moral law. For example, only lie if you think it's always good to lie. Kant also thought that the moral value of an action depended on the intent behind it and not its outcome or consequence. This logic plays into an accompanying formula for deontology, Kant's principle of humanity, which states that we should act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. In other words, if you're treating another person as a means to an end, you're not being ethical. So is deontology compatible with the C word? Oh, come on, you know that I meant capitalism. You know that that's what I meant. Well, a hardcore Ayn Rand acolyte could do capitalism and feel like they are in line with the categorical imperative because they want everyone else to be doing capitalism too. But it's complicated when we bring in the principle of humanity, as it's hard to imagine both being good at capitalism and treating people as ends in themselves. For example, how could you justify laying off a bunch of employees for the sake of increasing profit if you also think you're being ethical in deontological terms? Finally, we have consequentialism, the idea that we can best judge the ethics of an action by its consequences. If for Kant, intent matters more than outcome, for a consequentialist, outcome matters more than intent. Consequentialism operates by establishing what results are deemed good or desirable, and then evaluates actions on their ability to arrive at these results. So if I'm thinking of lying, or donating to charity, or helping a friend move, I will consider what to do on the basis of what will come of each of those actions. Consequentialism has a tricky relationship to capitalism, as it's easy to use an ends justifies the means logic here, which means that technically, if the machinations of the capitalist market help provide the funds to do good stuff, then why not? And this is all very much in line with Silicon Valley nonprofit culture, often referred to as the California ideology. So if you're a Bill Gates type, you can make potentially ruthless business decisions as long as it provides you with the surplus capital to buy vaccines for the developing world. Sometimes talking ethics can feel a bit speculative, as so many of the examples are abstract. So let's look at the way in which various political and social philosophies are actively trying to change the world for the better. There's a lot of different ways to do this, but I'm going to focus on three: revolution, accelerationism, and long-termism. Revolutionary philosophers usually share a common point of orientation in the French Revolution, an 18th century French event that ended up shaping lots of 19th century German philosophy. In case you forgot, the basic gist is that under the French monarchy, economic and social inequality were terrible, and rather than politely asking them to fix stuff, the people took over and established a new system of government grounded in the principles of liberty, equality, and brotherhood. This also helped inspire the Age of Revolution in 18th century Europe, and this exemplifies the basic logic of revolution. If a system isn't working for a majority of people, then it needs to be fundamentally upended and replaced. Sometimes non-violently, sometimes violently. Even America had one, supposedly.
He'll save children, but not the British children.
For most contemporary philosophers sympathetic to revolution, the logic of capitalism fundamentally contradicts the egalitarian pursuits embodied by the 18th century revolutions. And maybe most importantly, the Haitian Revolution, which if you've seen the new Black Panther movie, there's a relationship between the Haitian Revolution and Wakanda Forever. If you know what it is, shout it out in the comments. So for them, the only way to build a more ethical society is to get rid of capitalism. Accelerationism is a post-revolutionary political philosophy that argues that the best way to change the world isn't to just destroy capitalism, but rather to actively accelerate capitalism and technological development. Because again, there is no outside of capitalism from which to resist. For thinkers on the left wing of this movement, accelerating technological development leads to egalitarian and liberatory innovations and practices like automation and universal basic income. According to the Accelerate Manifesto, accelerationists want to unleash latent productive forces. The material platform of neoliberalism does not need to be destroyed. It needs to be repurposed towards common ends. The existing infrastructure is not a capitalist stage to be smashed, but a springboard to launch towards post-capitalism. It's sort of like, rather than destroying the Death Star, they're talking about accelerating the technological forces of the Empire to use them to move beyond it towards something better, and hopefully more Jedi-friendly. It's also worth noting that there's a right-wing side to this movement. For more on all of this, you can check out our video on automation, where we talk about contemporary accelerationism at length. So go watch it once you're done with this. Finally, we have long-termism, which is an outgrowth of effective altruism, and it's a contemporary brand of consequentialist thought focused on changing the world, not so much in the here and now, but for creating better conditions for future humans. An ungenerous reading of long-termism was recently given by David Z. Morris, who called it another excuse for mercenary corner cutting today, so long as you commit your loot to improving tomorrow. A more generous description offered by Dylan Matthews is that long-termism is the argument that because so many more humans and other intelligent beings could live in the future than live today, the most important thing for altruistic people to do in the present moment is to ensure that the future comes to be at all by preventing existential risks, and that it's as good as possible. As when I drive by unhoused people these days, giving them nothing, I scream at them, "But I'm making things better for people in 1,000 years." And they say, "Oh, thank you, Michael, thank you so much." And to be clear, the phrase other intelligent beings is intentional, as long-termists are concerned with making conditions good for future AI as well. So back to our main question, can we be ethical under capitalism? Is only revolution going to change things, or can well-intentioned Silicon Valley geniuses use their bags of money to save us? And is there any hope of things getting better within this system? For the revolutionaries, capitalism itself is fundamentally unethical, and those trying to use it for ethical means are like people trying to use condoms to get pregnant. Because the system is morally flawed, the onus is on individuals to foster ethical commitments counter to the dominant system, while acknowledging that no one can be held responsible for pure morality under capitalism. For example, you can be against the fossil fuel industry and its effects on the climate, but you're not a bad person if you still have to drive to work. But it is also worth noting that doing a revolution is pretty hard and often gets really messy, so don't try one before consulting your local political philosopher.
Do you want me to get naked and start the revolution?
The left accelerationists agree that capitalism as it currently stands is at odds with any type of egalitarian ethic, but their solution isn't to resist from the outside to overthrow the system, because to them, that outside doesn't exist. Instead, they want to accelerate the development of capitalism itself to get closer to the type of automated technologies that will actually change our lives. To again quote the Accelerate Manifesto, what accelerationism pushes towards is a future that is more modern, an alternative modernity that neoliberalism is inherently unable to generate. The future must be cracked open once again, unfastening our horizons towards the universal possibilities of the outside. But, like revolution, this one also takes a good amount of critical mass and power to really get rolling. And the authors of the Accelerate Manifesto acknowledge that a first and necessary step of this process is building effective leftist accelerationist organizations. Unlike revolution and accelerationism, long-termism takes a more abstract approach to creating an ethical world, one that is not inherently critical of capitalism. Rather than calling for a replacement for capitalism or trying to use capitalism against itself, long-termists aim to create future conditions amenable to potential life. As one of its key voices, Toby Ord, says, long-termism is an ethical view that is especially concerned with the impacts of our actions on the long-term future. It takes seriously the fact that our own generation is but one page in a much longer story, and that our most important role may be how we shape or fail to shape that story. Another voice of this movement has said, if you ask me for my top 20 list of changes I want to see in the world, then overthrowing capitalism is not one of them. There are much bigger issues. But for some, this boils down to simply accepting systems of power as they exist in the world without any critical analysis. This, of course, begs the question, is it better to accept and try to work within the system, injustice and all, for the sake of a better future for our great-great-great-grandchildren and or AI? Ultimately, it seems like maybe there isn't an easy answer to the question of whether or not capitalism can be ethical. And that's why for philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, building an ethical society starts from birth and involves the whole of the educational, political, and economic systems. And for those more inclined to revolution, it would involve doing a hard reset on society as we know it. I want to give the final word on the matter to philosopher Alain Badiou, who sort of squares the circle of some of what we're discussing by arguing that ethics are situational, i.e. relative to the particular situations we find ourselves in. As he says, ethics does not exist. There is only the ethic of, i.e. the ethical demands of particular situations and circumstances. He thinks this is oppositional to contemporary humanitarian ethics, which is nihilist because its underlying conviction is that the only thing that can really happen to someone is death, which for him means that rather than creating new and better forms of living, this type of ethic just wants slightly less people to die. Instead of playing defense against death, Badiou thinks ethics is about being faithful to a positive principle, grounded in a sense of equality that can help build a new world. His book on this, which is aptly titled Ethics, is a really great read, and I think it applies to a lot of what we're talking about, so please check that book out. What do you all think about this? Are we stuck doing our best inside the system we were born into? Does capitalism have a surprising moral bright side? Or is our only hope to write a Craigslist post asking if anyone else wants to meet up and do a revolution this weekend? Let us know in the comments. Thank you so much for all your support. Thank you especially to our patrons. We couldn't do it without you. If you want to support the channel via Patreon, there's a link in the description. But as always, thanks so much for watching. We'll see you later.